GPAMP's Media Analysis Broadcast. I'm J-Dog. Let's get right into it. So, we have an article here from Variety, Toxic Fandom, How Hollywood is Battling Fans Who Are Just Out for Blood, from social media boot camps to superfan focus groups. This is again from Variety by an Adam B. Vari. We have a collage here, which is various clips of, some of them are streaming shows, maybe all of them. I recognize some of them, and some of them I may be familiar with some of the criticism. Some of them I'm probably not. Actually, a few of them I actually like that I could pick out from there, but we'll get into that later. So, starting the article, on the 28th of August, Amandla Stenberg, okay, that's Amandla with an L-A at the end, Stenberg. This is the spelling from the article. The lead of the Star Wars series The Acolyte posted an 8.5-minute video to her Instagram about Lucasfilm's abrupt decision not to pick up the show for a second season, just a month after the season 1 finale streamed on Disney+. Quote unquote, "This is a huge shock for me," Stenberg said. "Since the series was announced in 2020, she continued, we started experiencing a rampage of, I would say, hyper-conservative bigotry and vitriol, prejudice, hatred, and hateful language towards us." Stenberg was unavailable for comment for this story. So what we have here, it's obviously this is an opinion article, just to go ahead and break out here and do some analysis. So Adam was unable to actually get Stenberg to directly speak to him for the purposes of publishing this article. What we have here is something that was quoted back on the 28th of August, presumably in a different outlet here. Yeah, that was on from her Instagram, and that's actually already kind of an adverse basis on which to start the article. You don't actually have the source, the first-hand source, which you're trying to quote for the purposes of the article. It is her announcement, so this is definitely not taking her out of context, but already this is kind of sus from a journalistic standpoint. Your principal source for your opinion piece, which you're introducing, is already not speaking to you, or at least is unavailable at the time you're going to publication. So this could be considered either in a rush to press, or basically just kind of a weakly argued article on the basis of something that's cherry-picked from, albeit a public statement someone has made. So this is a little bit stretching it already, and there's very clear, I want to say, slanted basis to it. It's very charged language going in the quote from this person that, again, the author of the article is not able to source directly. So this is already kind of a sus basis for the article to begin. It's obviously an op-ed, an opinion article. Let's resume the article. So, in other words, The Acolyte was the latest high-profile target of the quote-unquote toxic fandom. That's a hyperlink. I'm not going to follow that. The catch-all term for when fan criticism curdles from good-faith dissatisfaction into a relentlessly negative, often bigoted online campaign against either the project or its stars or creative leaders. So that's very broad. I'm going to jump out again here with a little analysis. Basically, that's, speaking of a catch-all, it's basically any criticism that's persistent, right? We'll say that is criticism that goes on for a while or is consistent in nature, that somehow makes it, quote-unquote, by the author's own opinion, curdle, and that somehow perhaps may be seen to kind of discredit that criticism, because if it's a consistent criticism, right, if it's a persistent criticism, if that criticism is maintained, somehow it may be impeachable, right, on its basis that it may be, curdled, it may be stale, right. If that criticism does not change, then that's no longer a good faith discussion, right? That's the implication here. I disagree with that. I believe that a consistent criticism can remain a good faith criticism, and so I'd say already there's a fallacy being introduced here. And if there's dissatisfaction that's evident in the criticism, it's perhaps prejudicially impeaching it on the basis that, again, because it's enduring criticism, it's carried on the same way for any length of time, well, that might not be in good faith. I disagree with that. So to go back to the article, relentlessly negative, often bigoted online campaign. So this is could be considered like a collectivizing argument, right? This is ascribing collective action or perhaps an organized basis to these to these criticisms. So I think already this is again a stretch. Where's the author's evidence that this is in any way a campaign, right? If this language is used informally, I think that should be couched a little differently, right? Because we're talking about a campaign that's typically something that's organized. Think about a political campaign. Think about a military campaign. Definitely organized. So that's kind of a weasel word in this context. If it is indeed a campaign, this is a citation needed situation. We're going to need to see some evidence that this is in any way organized versus just in aggregate criticisms of people coming out against this for whatever reason, on whatever basis. They may have some consistent elements to them, and so that's maybe where we get the conservative bigotry and all that. But again, that's very much a citation requested situation, especially describing it as a campaign. That doesn't actually wash at all based on anything that's been presented so far in the article. We'll see if that's substantiated in any way going further down. So jumping back in here, against I the Project, it stars creative leaders. So speaking of a catch-all situation, that's basically not only against the project, whatever it is, whatever the show may be. We're talking about against anyone associated with it, right? So any kind of enduring criticism that's taken forward to either the artwork itself or anyone involved, principal or associated, is seen to be lacking in good faith. So that's a lot of there's some weasel words in there and some collectivizing language, guilt by association. There's definitely some potential fallacies contained in this so far. Let us proceed. In a franchise economy increasingly dependent upon established audience devotion to drive the bottom line, the threat of toxic fandoms poisoning that enthusiasm has become a seemingly intractable headache for almost every studio, and it's only getting worse. Okay, well, that sounds really troubling. Although, again, there's a whole lot of loaded terminology and kind of some categorical generalizations there that definitely merit bearing out. Okay, so before we get into how troubling it is, we ought to have that evidence. But nonetheless, I will proceed with the article. It comes with the territory, but it's gotten incredibly loud in the last couple of years, says a veteran marketing executive at a major studio. People are just out for blood, regardless. They think the purity of the first version will never be replaced, or that you've done something to upset the canon of a beloved franchise, and they're going to take you down for doing so. Is that really how this is perceived? Right, well, that could be a misconception. I think for most fans, for most gamers, when it comes down to it, what we're looking for is integrity, continuity, and character that bears resemblance, bears relation, and overall offers kind of maybe thematic and character continuity with what we've come to expect from either a first installment in something that's an original work in media, like film or television, or something that's even an adaptation of that from a work of literature, from a play, from some other source. What I think most audiences, most fans, and most gamers, more to the point, are looking for is that it's not something wholly new. It's not something that's arbitrarily derivative or even non-derivative, and that it doesn't bear anything that would in another type of product category, right? Something that's actually has a little bit more science to it, right? Because this is art. But in the category of consumer products, if we're talking about actual things like dishwashers, for example, or any other type of product for which empirical characteristics and functional considerations are part of the operative basis for the product, and also for the advertising for the product, right? These are things that either are or aren't, right? That they are very black and white, and so these things are not present as greatly, right? It's not the same with art, and it's both subjective and to some extent arbitrary, but those are details that are held. Those are aspects that are in the mind of the perceiver, right? Of whoever is appreciating the art. If something reminds them of something, if it's something that they feel has a continuity has a strong relationship to something that they're familiar with. That's something that is obviously hard to instill just by following on from someone's artwork. So I could see how that could be difficult for artists, writers in particular, may or may not be able to follow up on established work and maintain the same type of characterizations, the same type of thematic settings, the same type of atmosphere, right, that may be perceived in enjoying the original work. And acknowledging that, at the same time, that's something that's craved and demanded by audiences, by interactive media consumers, gamers. That's something you can't really just arbitrarily substitute something in and kind of dismissively disregard without earning and generating to some extent the ire of a large contingent of the followers of that type of art or those artists' works, whoever originated it. That's something that you really don't want to mess with for the sake of so doing, unless that's part of a marketing strategy, right? If that's a marketing ploy, that might actually make more sense. But outside of that, though, what we're talking about here is really kind of messing with people's emotions, playing with their sometimes very, very beloved, as they use the word in the article, very deeply even cherished artistic works that they really invest themselves in, right? They see themselves in, or they see significances that bear out resemblances in their own life and experience. These are works of art that speak to people, and people rightly are connected to them. They feel invested in them, and they become, as others have noted, I believe a contemporary of mine on this platform and others, Dictor von Doomcock, for one, has noted that people become very attached to these, like their folk tales. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're retelling of classic folk tales. They become part of our culture. Now, whether they're based on contemporary forms and formats of media or not, right, just because it's told through the artistic medium of film, for example, does not singularly disqualify or disparage the notion that these are products of a culture, that these are products of the American voice, for example, coming out of Hollywood, that they're not products of their time. These are things that are their characteristics linked to the creation of these artistic products, and people attach deep sentimental, sometimes very, very emotional significance to those things. They can become cultural touchstones. Take, for instance, E.T. or Indiana Jones. These are things that Spielberg and Lucas crafted, but everyone knows them. They've become cultural touchstones. In the same way you would view the cultural touchstones of the things that Walt Disney produced. Those people and their legions of artists and craftsmen and everyone else involved with the production, they created legends. And in the case of Disney, it was derived from European folklore. So these were actual folk tales, things with a deep, steeped tradition behind them, things that might have even translated from oral traditions into written language, which were then translated into film. Not something that can be arbitrarily messed with in terms of what its foundations are and its meanings to the cultures that bore them and bear them. These things have significance that go beyond the purely artistic, right? Sometimes I think it's very possible it's easy to lose perspective on what the audience's experience is when you're when you spend most of your time kind of behind the desk or in the artist's workshop. It could be relatively easier from a production standpoint to take for granted your work, or to produce it in profusion and not realize the importance that might be attached to it at some point. And likewise, it can be too tempting, I think, conversely, if it's something that really has a larger and established appreciative following. It's something that may deserve more reverence, may deserve more introspection in terms of its crafting than had it been something that was a wholly original work. These are things that I believe artists should take into consideration, and I believe that law and culture needs to recognize as things that really should be kept in mind and actually to some extent considered as a factor in regulatory processes, because culture matters. And when you take the some of the beloved products of a culture and arbitrarily impugn the value that some people attach to it, that's going to generate some perhaps very rightly felt and deeply held feelings of resentment. It may instigate something akin to a backlash, and it may have a lot of passion, a lot of sentimentality attached to it. So these are things that I believe all merit keeping in mind with respect to these topics. And in spite of the evident difficulty that production companies and artists may have with producing consistent art or art that audiences perceive as authentic, and possessing good continuity with what came before, that's something that can't be just swept away. It can't be just pushed aside as a consideration, just because this is, of course, difficult as a process. It's something that really should be given due reflection, and regardless of the circumstances of ownership, regardless of the circumstances of rights holdership, there's a culture to consider. There is an artistic following that should be kept in mind, and people's feelings on all sides should be respected. And I think that this bears a lot more in-depth contemplation as across cultures and countries, but since Hollywood is American, I think, and many of these video game companies have either branches here or started here, these all are worth examining from a cultural standpoint, because they're not just arbitrarily crafted pieces of art. They are things that people will attach sentimental and even customary significances to, and when that is stepped on, there's going to be hurt feelings. And that's not something that you can just arbitrarily dismiss. So I think I'll proceed to the next topic here. Next paragraph. Sometimes the toxic fandoms behave reactively. House of the Dragon episode, a House of the Dragon episode featuring two female characters kissing, and an episode of The Last of Us focusing on a gay couple were both review bombed. The practice of mobbing sites like Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb with negative user reviews, which gained mainstream attention following the premiere of 2017's Star Wars: The Last Jedi. And an entire YouTube ecosystem is devoted to declaring projects like The Marvels and The Boys quote-unquote woke garbage, among other pungent sobriquets. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Yeah, that is one way of putting it. Firstly, let's dissect this. The review bomb claim is basically a way of it's a particular way of characterizing mass fan feedback, right? We live in a modern world and a society in which reviews are able to be delivered live en masse, based on actual individual fan experiences, consumer encounters with the product, right? So this is something that formerly was not possible, right? Media in the 20th century was particularly gate-kept, if you will, by certain network pseudo-monopolies, quasi-monopolies, and in some cases with certain government oversight, right, regulatory oversight, for what was permissible in a broadcast medium and broadcast environments, and there was a certain different and more stringent degree of control than anyone born post-Reagan, right, the post-Reagan administration, which liberalized and deregulated a lot of these things, a lot of these controls and restrictions, both commercially and in content terms, from just being published in a way to whatever the company wanted, which is much more the case now than it was then. So what we have now with the internet, in addition to that, is the completely open-ended, or at least very much open-ended, because it is being drawn back and restricted more, basis for individual members of the public, consumers, to go and offer their feedback on their product encounter, right? So if it's an entertainment product, if it's a movie, if it's a game, we're able to go and speak out about it on some of the forums, right? So there's forums that are more or less official. Everyone knows them. One of them is Rotten Tomatoes. Another great one is Steam Reviews. And there's things like Amazon product reviews for other stuff. But yeah, this is something that's relatively new. It's not super new, but we're talking a couple decades here where the public has actually been able to offer direct feedback and offer feedback at any scale, like en masse, to the makers of their products. And so that's something that is not very well established, right, in popular canon, in terms of how the media covers these things, in terms of how, frankly, the political class in the U.S. and maybe other places like Anglophone countries, Britain, Australia, how they treat this as kind of still as something very novel and rather obscure, right? You could tell by the language here where it kind of gives a little explanation, right? Sometimes the toxic fandoms behave reactively. And then it goes on mobbing sites like Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb with negative user reviews. So this is like this is a boomer speak, right? So this is boomer educational speak where it's couched in terms of some kind of novel and unexpected situation, as though anyone who's actually remotely media aware has known for a decade plus that you can go on Rotten Tomatoes and speak up or down on your favorite or just happenstance seen media, right? So that's something that's not all that weird, not all that new. But what is new is the media, at least since we'll say 2016, the media characterizing these in some kind of very distant, mysterious terms where there are hobgoblins and enemies, particularly conservative enemies, enemies of kindness and decency, hateful people. These are the ways that these criticisms are leveled, and this is another article in that same vein. Toxic fandoms are toxic because they're categorized as toxic. That's one of the things that they all have in common. So that's a little bit of editorial commentary from me on that, but we do have a lot more article to get to. So let's get right into that. The reviews gained mainstream attention following the premiere of 2017's Star Wars The Last Jedi, and an entire YouTube ecosystem is devoted to declaring projects like The Marvels, The Boys, woke garbage, among other pungent sobriquets. So, yeah, that's pretty much, there is a lot of commentary right? There's a lot of YouTube reviews and reviewers that do go into these, and the verbiage woke garbage is often heard there, because frankly a lot of the fans themselves are reflecting upon it in such a way where they believe it to be kind of woke or kind of introducing different concepts of either racial or sexual or other types of things that are seen as kind of maybe deviations from either the storyline or societal norms. And some of that may be more or less based on the story itself. So just to jump out here with a little commentary, one thing that I noticed when when Amazon did the Lord of the Rings spin-off, right, the Rings of Power, is they had a black female actress who played one of the dwarf, I believe one of the dwarf queens. Now, I actually haven't seen this one, and I have a very specific reason for not seeing it. It's not that there is a black actress, right, in real life black actress who is playing a dark pigmented female dwarf queen. It's actually that she doesn't have a beard, because as an adherent to the lore, as a fan of Tolkien's work, for me that lore is paramount. That is something that I do view to be very important. It's extremely salient to my ingestion of the material. So fidelity in spirit and principle terms, if not completely in all the practicalities of the production, and in practical terms where perhaps the spirit certain liberties are taken with, if both of those things are seen to lack, I'm myself personally, I'm going to have a problem with that material. I definitely will not. I will not agree to want to see it or want to promote it, and whether or not I speak out against it particularly, because that's a form of promotion, that's going to be on a very much a case-by-case basis. For me, I do evaluate it with the practical and principle considerations of, is this really related? Is this really something I want to bother with based on my prior experience, the good taste in my mouth based on how those franchises started out, and what the authors originally meant. So yeah, if it doesn't have a continuity, I'm going to have a problem with that. So I may be part of this anti-woke critic commentariat just on the basis that I do have a persistent consideration of that as relevant to me. It's important to me, and also that I don't actually accept the principal case that it should be accepted just because it is new and just because it is branded as something that I'm already familiar with and love. So yeah, that's something that if woke means that it deviates from whatever the material was, then I'm going to be suspect and possibly rejecting of that material on that basis. Yeah, it's like if there's no actual relationship to the to what I came there for originally, with a game, movie, music, if it's not related, don't call it the same thing. It's very simple, really. And there would be more interest as an original work of art than trying to pass off something as a sequel where clearly it doesn't actually follow. Just as frequently, going back to the article, just as frequently the backlash begins before the project has seen the light of day. A Reddit mega-thread dedicated to outrage over Bridgerton casting a black woman, Masali Beduza, as the love interest of Francesca Hannah Dodd, social media epithets directed at the actors of color cast as elves and dwarfs of Lord of the Rings of Power, death threats aimed at Leslie Jones during her press tour for 2016. So, wow, that is a very loaded paragraph. Again, it kind of just stuffs it all in there without exploring any of the individual incidents or offering any kind of corroborating detail in the article again as yet. This is a very loaded, very slanted article. Let's dissect it a little bit here because there's really nothing to go on. Yeah, so apparently some of the criticisms, according to this article, were that a black woman was cast. Okay, that's what it is. It's kind of unfortunate if that represents a majority view, but I don't think that's the case. I think you're probably going to get some people that have that criticism. A lot of others are not. The social media epithets directed at actors of color cast as elves and dwarfs in Lord of the Rings. Yeah, I mean that's pretty immature, but we must remember, I think, and I think it's important to keep perspective on this sort of thing, that a considerable part of the fan base and a considerable part of the actual consumer group demographic that's going to go and see this stuff, maybe middle school aged, maybe high school aged. Young professionals and college aged people. Those are going to probably be your median for people interested in this kind of stuff. You will, of course, with a literary classic like Lord of the Rings, get a lot of middle aged and older interest from those demographics as well. But on balance, who's going to go and see it in theaters? Who's going to watch it on streaming? It's probably going to skew younger, pretty young, and the idea that this is that this is a very credible criticism or that this represents a majority is probably a real stretch. We're talking death threats over a movie or a show. We could just be speaking about basically kids doing swatting. Okay, the equivalent of swatting. That's pretty much what we could be looking at here if we're to be reasonable about this. Swatting, for those who may be unaware, is basically when typically someone online in like an online game will will rage bait someone. In order to get the rage bait is basically you try to troll someone to get up their hackles about something in the game or their play style or whatever it is. They're gonna try and get your goat. When they get you to respond, they're gonna try and get some information from you. That's rage baiting, and then from there, that's a SWAT scenario. So being swatted is what it sounds like. If somebody gets your address, then they may very well try to dial in local authorities to try and report some incident. Okay, typically involving something emergency services would respond to. So that's swatting for anyone that actually doesn't know what that is. I doubt that's the case for anyone watching this, but in essence, it's typically probably the average age of the person doing that is in their mid-teens at best, right? That's typically where that comes from, and they're not actually giving too serious a criticism if that's where they're coming from with like racial epithets and death threats. You're probably talking about school-age people. And so I think this as a variety article, speaking about a so-called toxic fandom, we could just be speaking about kids being kids, right? Like this is actually probably just something that's from a basis of considerable immaturity, and it probably doesn't represent a significant faction, if not the majority of the people that are going to be criticizing given one of these shows, games, movies, etc. And yeah, I was actually, just on an editorial note personally, I was and am a fan of the Ghostbusters series. You can see the mug. I'm a long time lover of Ghostbusters lore, media, all that. In 2016, when that movie dropped, to use the lingo, I was open-minded about it initially, and what turned my view on that was how very denigrating the performances, the dialogue, the framing of those scenes were to the lore, to the history, even the very high-handed and offhanded treatment of the original stars. Bill Murray, Ernie Hudson, Dan Aykroyd. They all took it really well, right? They played along great. They understand comedy, and they were great sports. But when it comes down to it, they were kind of put down a little bit in those performances. I did not see them get picked back up, right? So in stand up, there's a comment. There's a certain custom, right, where if you're going to make some kind of comment towards another comic that kind of puts them down a little bit, it's considered good form, and it's kind of good practice in comedy. You bring them back up somehow, right? Restore a little bit of their dignity with the way you're going to conduct your performance going forward. I didn't see a lot of that, if really anything like that, in Ghostbusters 2016 with respect to the OGs, right? The original Ghostbusters. They're kind of used as a slapstick comic fodder, and then kind of dismissed just as easily. That hurt my heart a little bit as a Ghostbusters fan. So that singularly is a disincentive to say I'm a fan of that performance and of that movie. Also, there's some other cliches invoked, which frankly was probably a really good counterpoint. If you look at Janine's character in the original, you could say that she was a bit of caricature, right? There were some maybe feminist-related thoughts that could be introduced based around her character, how much of a role she played, all of that. And so the male character, the male secretary in 2016, was perhaps kind of a bookend, right? Like a male counterpart to Janine's character, not really given a whole lot of latitude in terms of the performance, but essentially kind of was playing a trope as an airheaded secretary. Funny on a basic level, but I think they definitely overplayed that beyond anything that was really intended or really inferred like reasonably. When you look at the Janine character in the original series, Janine is one of the most beloved, respected, and iconic characters. I mean, every one of the Ghostbusters were. And although she was not one of the Ghostbusters in terms of her performance role, right, like what she did, what her functional role was as a job, she in the second movie did assist in making the transition to a Ghostbuster for the accountant, right? So that was something she was involved. Even though she was not herself packing a proton pack, so she was not a bit part player. She was a player with centrality to more than that, also as a handmaiden practically to the couple in the second movie. So, not to mention, she probably would have had a different and stronger role in the third, based on her interaction potentially with Lewis. We don't know that, but we know that was setting up the story for a possible change in that direction. So that would have that storyline, if it was explored, would have been very interesting. But she was not a bit part player in either of the original movies, and I don't really think that that was reflected well in a roundabout way with the male secretary in 2016. Seemed to me he was very much a slap, like a whipping boy, right? A slapstick cardboard cutout character alongside all the original Ghostbusters, and that to me puts it in the territory of being kind of either a parody or a diss, right? I mean, it's hard to actually characterize it in any other way. For those reasons, 2016 did miss the mark and did not meet with my interest as a longtime fan and loyalist to the IP. I actually am. This is a complete digression, but I am a huge fan, and as you can see from some of the stuff I got here, that actually was a real miss as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, I mean, I could be more vitriolic about it, but that kind of thing obviously is not interpreted as well as it might be as far as consumer criticism and commentary goes. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here with that on that subject. But 2016 was a turning point, a real turning point in how these sorts of things were characterized, in terms of how these things were discussed in the mainstream media, because of the tremendous we could say a backlash or a fan response to what was a really intensely disrespectful treatment of a beloved franchise in the opinion of not just a few people. It was a very, very well-rounded cross section of the Ghostbusters fan community, which held the less than satisfactory viewpoint on what they would rate that movie as. And we have some pretty in-depth reasoning for that. It's often given short shrift and mischaracterized in the mainstream media as far as what those criticisms were constituted from. And I think they take some of the worst examples of that in order to highlight and kind of mischaracterize the basis of those criticisms. So that's very unfortunate. Ultimately, I'd like to move on in the article, and we can get into my Ghostbuster commentary more in another video. Perhaps the greatest irony of this phenomenon is the disproportionate impact that these toxic fandoms have relative to their actual number. The vast majority of any fandom are casual fans, says John Van Sitters, VP of Star Trek brand development, who has been with the storied franchise since the 1990s. The number of people who live and die on their franchise are very, very few, and then those who come after things that they espouse to love with venom are a really, really tiny subset of that already smaller subset of the fandom. It's just much easier to see it now. I don't know that it's really that much broader than where things were in 1995. It's just that the bullhorn wasn't there. That's probably pretty fair. As I pointed out, the accessibility that the modern internet has allowed for direct and immediate wide-scale fan feedback, consumer criticism in some cases, of various entertainment properties, products. That is relatively novel, but again, we're talking about something in the last 20 years that's been increasing in availability and widespread understanding that this is an option for people to express their feedback. It's also getting a lot of pushback from institutional forces, both in the media here, as we see, and in the people that they're quoting that are industry insiders. So this is a somewhat new relationship for everybody involved. It's not totally new. And so for anyone that's has never heard of Rotten Tomatoes, never encountered a bad review for a product online, I'm thinking this is an incredibly small audience themselves that they would be speaking to here, as if these things are completely new concepts to them. It seems to me a little bit like they're kind of speaking to themselves, the way this article is being couched. I don't know who hasn't bought something online and doesn't read reviews about that. I mean, some people don't, but everybody knows they're there. So this isn't as novel as it's presented. So I consider that to be a little bit of implicit disingenuousness in the way that this is presented. It presents it as an obscure topic, and we're really not dealing with something that's altogether that obscure at this point as a phenomenon. It's more a way of, I think, a little bit putting some distance between the people offering the feedback on these properties and Adam, who's writing this article, as if somehow there really is a great distance. Online, there just isn't, and I think the media is having a great deal of difficulty coming to terms with that. So, to continue with the article, for some, combating that bullhorn amounts to acting as if they can't hear it. That's the truth. That's my commentary. Particularly when it's a negative, toxic conversation. We don't even engage, says the TV marketing executive. Like with toxic people, you try not to give it too much oxygen. One principal concern is that reacting to these kinds of attacks risks alienating fans who are unhappy with creative choices about a franchise, but haven't tipped over into abusive behavior. So a studio may attempt to amplify friendlier voices instead. We'll reply to comments that are positive and elevate those things, says the TV exec. I think that's great. I think that's absolutely great. That's a wonderful policy. On a personal note, I adhere to personally accentuate the positive, right? If you have the opportunity to engage with something and someone that's positive and going to bring out the good in you, bring out the good in that situation, over something that's negative, like maybe this article, try and do the positive first, right? Do the positive first and foremost. Bring up the people that are going to bring you up. bring those up around you, that bring up the things you're interested in, right? That's all a good policy. That's stuff that I definitely would agree with from a perspective standpoint. But what we're dealing with here is online feedback, right, for media properties. So without some, because we are talking about artwork here, and we're also talking about commercial products, without some realistic assessment of critical commentary, negative feedback, you're really kind of shooting yourself in the foot, in my opinion, because your consumers are the ones who will educate you in some cases, in many cases even, about where you're going wrong as an enterprise, and artistically, where that may apply, where they really just disagree with the artistic choice you make on something. So if you're not receptive to that, as an artist, you can do that. But as an artist, also traditionally as solo artists, you can suffer the consequences of not finding as many patrons for your art. That's not exactly a particularly divisive observation in my view. Art has always required patrons, or in terms of commercial artwork, clients. So the idea that that's somehow beyond the pale it's ludicrous on its face. Art does require will, and it does require initiative on the artist's part, but that doesn't mean to say that it is totally devoid of appreciation or criticism by those who are exposed to that art, right? Those who choose to appreciate it, engage in it, and interact with that art, right, in the case of video games. So still, toxic fandoms have shown a pernicious Still, toxic fandoms have grown so pernicious that they'll become a fact of life for many, and so powerful that while talent, executives, and publicists will privately bemoan the issue, fear of inadvertently triggering another backlash kept several studios from speaking for this story, even on background. So again, Adam here is pleading credulity. He's basically saying that although he was able to make some very general claims about the kinds of feedback that have been offered, and offer a few quotations, we're I'm going to say maybe a third, maybe halfway through this article, and really the substance is pretty thin here. The studios won't comment, and it's just a lose-lose. That's what he says. That may be true, right? Maybe that is an anonymous as one rep. So we have another anonymous quotation here. Maybe they are just very leery of engaging with the fans because they believe that that would only potentially increase any kind of negative feedback that exists, any kind of negative sentiment that's already there. That's a very cynical take, in my view. It may also be prudent from a certain point of view in corporate land, right? Like these companies have certain ways of operating, and not engaging is certainly one way of addressing certain issues, certain trends with products and consumer sentiment. But it may not be the best one. In my opinion, right? If you have an artistic product, a creative product, especially an interactive one like video games, I think it comes down to a willingness to see things from an art appreciator's point of view, from a consumer's point of view, that really, if not dictates, it certainly should influence the direction of commercial activity in that vein going forward. Because, again, there's a patron component here when we're talking about something that's artistic or entertainment related in nature. Your fans, your customers are your patrons, and an unwillingness to engage with them realistically, even when it's pretty critical, could represent a certain culture of cowardice in corporate America, particularly. And I think that's actually in the long term that kind of we'll say conduct conservatism, right? That reticence to go out there and actually engage with the fans, face the music, hear the feedback. in the long term, that's kind of going to reduce the bubble of where the creativity is allowed to go, based on actual feedback, right? Based on real input from those who are the receivers of that product, right? Those who are going to be the recipients of whatever the outcome of those creative processes are. And that's there are ways of phrasing that. I think I'm going to avoid putting it in so specific a terminology. But long story short, without that feedback, you get an increasingly small bubble that you can actually say, oh, this is organic input. And so it kind of can be a runaway train at the studio, or a runaway direction from an artistic standpoint. And the market may look skeptically upon that, and that is not that's not a hateful observation. That's not a hateful thing to say. That's simply market reality. That's something that is typically considered to be innate in capitalism, whether you're a fan of that system or not, or you believe we have that or not, or to whatever degree or form. If that is the system we have, that's certainly a component of it. So yeah, a market skepticism is something that's to be expected when input is kind of issued, denied, and pathologized, in fact. Which I'd say is somewhat the basis of this article, and so that's something that should be taken into account. Those who did talk with Variety all agreed that the best defense is to avoid provoking fandoms in the first place. That's probably a fair point. If you know that whatever creative direction you're taking, or whatever sausage making and the at the the production level is going to be an issue. It's going to, in some of the more academic language of our day, it's going to trigger clinical language of our day. Also, is going to trigger a lot of the fans. It may bear consideration that would not be the best course of action. It really depends what you're going for, right? I mean, sometimes art is very bold, and it can be appreciated on the basis of its audacity. But a lot of these shows are they're bold in ways, in my opinion, that don't do the underlying material any great justice, and they are bold in ways that, frankly, are just digressions. They're either at digressions from or at odds with the original material, in some or so many ways. And that doesn't really do anyone much good, right? Like, it's a question of whether people don't like it because it's just different from the material, or they don't like the particulars of how it's different, and it contributes more to confusion around the product, and artistic ambiguity, right? And that doesn't, to me, that's the opposite of boldness in an artistic sense. Artistic ambiguity is kind of like, is putting it in the realm of abstract art, right? And abstract art, by its nature, is meant to garner all of the wide range of perceptions and appreciation of it. That's not typically the way Western canon stories are devised. That's certainly not traditional art in how it's executed. So I think we should be clear if like an abstract art basis is the basis for this material to come forward, we should really be clear about the the genre, the category, and the emphasis on what the execution of this artistry is, in order to not again have consumer confusion around what they're being offered is. It seems to me to hem up against closely, not falsely advertising something when it's an actual good, like a physical good, or a service. It isn't that, because it's not those things directly, right? It is an ephemeral product. We're talking about things that are experiences, more or less, sound, light, video, interaction in the case of video games, something that requires, investiture on the part of the player. So those are things that are more experiential in nature and harder to quantify. Certainly going to be harder to regulate, but when it comes down to it, if you're if the fans, if a large segment of the fans feel hoodwinked, then maybe they were hoodwinked. That's kind of what it comes down to. It's sometimes, especially if you want to look at things like in any kind of remotely democratic way, if you have a super majority of your feedback is one negative direction, and has some consistent themes in it, it probably bears looking into why that came up so strongly. And you could definitely, the conclusion can be, oh, it's part of the culture, oh, it's part of an overly active part of the critical community, right? Some of the fan base may be a little hyper in their feedback, but that probably will not be the, if you're thoughtful about it, I would suggest it probably is not the end of what's relevant to consider there. It's probably just a factor that's a part of keeping perspective about assessing that, what the meaning of that critical commentary is. I don't think reducing it to that does anyone any favors. So perspective is important, but so is addressing the things that are actually brought up. If you're ever remotely interested in doing that from a commercial standpoint. Those who did talk with Variety all agreed that the best defense is to avoid provoking the fandoms. In addition to standard focus group testing, studios will assemble a specialized cluster of superfans. I think citation needed. What is a superfan? We know that that was, their so-called superfans were used with Lord of the Rings, the Amazon show, that were used to boost that. A lot of those were kind of they're viewed to be a little skeptically accepted by the general fan base, because some of them had evident commercial and influencer pasts, right, as either actors or organizers or some people that were involved in some way, right, industry adjacent. Or influencer adjacent, if not themselves in the industry or directly involved with the production. So that was seen to be a little bit of an AstroTurf campaign, and that's something I think we should look to avoid in the future. If you're going to describe them as super fans, let's not just fool ourselves that the fans are not going to see through that as an AstroTurf campaign to tell us kind of what we think about it. That's probably not going to work as well as it did in the past. Just straight up, it's really not. People talk to each other both on and offline, and that's especially fans, people that appreciate the lore. We're not likely to have our opinions swayed based on some influencer popping up with a glowing commentary. So to assess possible marketing materials for major franchise projects. That's good. Having market feedback it's what it's all about. That's essentially what I'm advocating here. Several studio insiders say they often put their talent through a social media boot camp, and then in some cases when the character is intentionally challenging a franchise's status quo, studios will, with the actor's permission, take over their social media accounts entirely. When things get really bad, especially involving threats of violence, security firms will scrub talent information from the internet to protect them from doxing. So, just on these points, doxing and threats of any kind online, completely unacceptable. That's my standpoint on it. That's also something, unfortunately, that's been a reality of the internet and the pre-internet, with electronic communications and probably telegrams and letters before that. People will behave badly, sometimes at a distance and sometimes in person, when they don't get their way, right? When people perceive themselves to be slighted in some cases, and frankly, when they value cultural touchstones, religious icons, sometimes political leaders or culturally significant personalities, if they're seen to be denigrated, disrespected, it's a known thing that will provoke certain responses. Now, I'm speaking in general and abstract terms. That's not a blanket statement of condoning that kind of activity on my part. On the contrary, that kind of activity is suspect. It's certainly reprehensible in principle terms, right? But there also is grounds on which to assess what if anything, precipitated it. And those are always fraught. Those are always contentious topics to delve into. So before anyone characterizes what I've said here as painting with a broad brush and condoning activity one way or the other, it's more complicated in general. I am not condoning in principle, as I've already stated, but I believe that these things have to be assessed essentially on a case-by-case basis. And the idea that there is only one kind of monolithic viewpoint from which to see it, right? There's one side. That's often a very assumptive posture on which to enter consideration of sometimes complex topics like this. So I'm going to say I'm skeptical of the whole outline and in some cases outcome of this narrative. But I definitely think that people need to conduct themselves in ways that are responsible, and that includes, of course, those in the mainstream media, authors and publishers who may reasonably understand that provoking large groups of people, artists, sometimes art and publishing can be provocational in nature, and we should try to be respectful, I think, of human sensibilities and artistic, cultural, religious, political, all of those sensitivities, right? They have to be taken into consideration at some level in order to have responsible output. And that isn't all on one side. And it shouldn't be. So, to continue with the article, in some particularly egregious cases, a direct response has been necessary. In 2022, after Obi-Wan Kenobi actor Moses Ingram denounced the hundreds of racist messages sent to her about her role, there is nothing anybody can do about this. There is nothing anybody can do to stop this hate, she said. Lucasfilm posted a statement to its Star Wars social media accounts that read, in part, "There are more than 20 million sentient species in the Star Wars galaxy. Don't choose to be a racist." That's a very appropriate response if there's a lot of commentary directed in a particular vein, related to a certain product. At the same time, though, it would probably behoove like the marketing team, their understanding maybe what precipitated that. Now, I'm going to presume, not knowing who this actor is, that they are a person of color, and that's probably a basis for some of the commentary. So that would certainly, without intending a pun here, color some of the response that they're going to be getting. My question is, how was it handled? How was that actor marketed? How was that product marketed? Does that product have an established lore for the character that they played? I don't know any of this because I've long since removed myself from the fandom for that particular intellectual property. I can comment on it, but I comment on it from a classic standpoint, not a standpoint of active engagement or interest. Essentially, since Lucas's kind of fumble with the prequel trilogy, that's kind of where I retired my interest. That was entirely. It was almost altogether unforced errors on Lucas's part. This is just a little digression there. So I don't think anything of the stuff. I don't think too much of the stuff that's followed that, really anything about that, has been more harmful to the franchise than what Lucas did there with the prequel trilogy. I think it kind of set the precedent for a lot of that. The stuff that's been done since then has been somewhat more explicit, and it's kind of like repudiation of or digression from the original lore, or supplanting of the original lore. Right? There's been some very high-handed creative moves, but frankly, I think this is all stuff that kind of degenerated according to a formula that Lucas set down. So I'm going to kind of credit him and blame him for that up front, and Kathleen Kennedy and people in her circle. I think they're kind of just following up on the questionable plays that Lucas started with in the later years. So that's really not something that I ascribe too much responsibility to Disney on particularly. I think they tried to rescue it, and I think they've been failing ever since. That's my overview of that. As for particular incidents of what was wrong with those movies, that deserves that some of those I have seen, and that deserves a whole episode, a whole review dedicated specifically to looking into those things. We can't do that here. But long story short, sending someone racially inflammatory messages online, probably not the best idea. I don't think that's going to really prompt them to change anything. And if anything, it's probably just going to get more articles like this published, which are of very middling to poor quality. I mean, this is it borders on hyperbole in terms of the way that it recounts these incidents, and it's anonymously sourced all over. Not great work, even for an op-ed, as far as journalism, in my opinion. But to continue on. Obi-Wan star Ewan McGregor saying that the abuse made him sick to my stomach, and that if you're sending her bullying messages, you're no Star Wars fan in my mind. Well, that's good that the stars, that the actors will stand up for themselves and their colleagues in principle. Totally support that. That is not and should not be seen to ipso facto invalidate all criticism, because some people apparently made some very derogatory, racially charged comments surrounding it. That's just unfortunate. That's just unfortunate and immature. So it's not my take on it is not to condone that. It is in fact to criticize that, and to criticize the notion that criticism can be dismissed categorically across the board, because some people have misconducted themselves in their approach to disapproving of the direction of some of these studios in developing some of these properties. Later that year, the cast of The Rings of Power condemned the relentless racism, threats, harassment, and abuse some of our castmates of color are being subjected to on a daily basis. Again, really unfortunate stuff. Actors from Lord of the Rings film trilogy posted photos of themselves wearing clothing featuring the ears of Middle-earth creatures in multiple skin tones underneath the message, "You are all welcome here," written in Elvish. That's adorable, number one. I support that message, number two. And absolutely none of that may be seen to disparage the artistic criticisms which aren't couched in racially pejorative and other inappropriate ways. So again, one thing does not invalidate the other, in spite of the fact it may reflect unfavorably on certain critical certain critical commentaries and certain groups of fans who may be lumped in together with those making those inappropriate types of criticisms. Those efforts may have had an effect. Continuing with the article, in an August interview with Amazon MGM Studios TV chief Vernon Sanders about the Rings of Power, the executive said the show hadn't experienced the same racist hostility in advance of the second season that had greeted the 2022 debut. People have had a chance to actually engage with the show, he said. Overwhelmingly, what we've seen is that the folks who came with an open mind can discuss and debate their favorite things, which takes you out of the place of that ugly conversation that happened with some folks who may have been infused with an agenda that's separate from the show itself. Okay, that's a bit of a reach. It's a bit of a speculation. They may have been, right? He doesn't know, right? Vernon Sanders does not know what the critical basis some of the people who criticized it were coming from. If it was on the face inappropriate in the way it was expressed, well, that may lend itself to the impression that they had malign intent in why they spoke out. But when it comes down to it, the second season, right, the first season of any show can be pretty rough. Some people will certainly overreact if a cherished franchise, a cherished property is given really poor treatment by the people producing more content, follow-up content on it, or anything based on it. So, impassioned pushback can be expected on some of that. Some of it may not be appropriate, and the difference is on the commercial side, on the business side, that's something that a certain amount of restraint, decorum, is typically advised. The market tends to reward fair dealers, right, and people that are that represent companies and products well, right, typically with a degree of decorum, maybe detachment from some of the criticism they may receive. And I think it's pretty advisable in general. Stooping to discuss some of the most inappropriate feedback you've received, some of the most vitriolic and hateful, which, to their credit, many studios decided to take a pass on with respect to this, the creation of this article. Is this an individual choice? It comes with its own set of challenges. So I think Vernon was pretty bold here in deciding to make a statement on it, and I think it's a very right-headed statement. Just my opinion. Yeah, I mean, people have an opportunity to kind of think things over, and let their opinions of a certain, their view of their engagement with a certain creative work settle after some time. So they may have found that the second season suited their interests and sensibilities as fans and appreciators of the lore more. And so some of that criticism might have been more tame on that basis. And some of it may have just been a little bit of early rash kind of prejudgments based on either first or second-hand accounts. Right, that kind of thing is not unexpected, particularly coming from the market, right, from just fans, civilians, not people associated with the production. So some of that less articulate feedback is kind of, it's going to be something to be expected. It shouldn't be tolerated when it comes down to something that's harmful, or perhaps very, very explicitly hurtful in nature. Right, that's something that definitely fans can improve their type of feedback in order to offer a constructive type of criticism to these commercial enterprises and their products, and a respectful criticism to the artists who may be behind them. But there's room for everyone to raise their sights with respect to how they're treating this phenomenon, and certainly how art is crafted in the future and going forward in a world in which fan feedback is it's going to come in hot and heavy, right? The market feedback is now on a scale and at a pace, a tempo that is it's greater and more rapid than ever before, and it may be more unfiltered, right? People that have the opportunity to just type something in a box and press send may not be giving it as much thought as if they had to put pen to paper, or if they had to go in person to criticize. So that's something that should be taken into account, right? Some of this may be a little bit taking this out of context, right? Because we've all had an opportunity to experience the internet and get a little bit more accustomed to how it works. So I think this article's framing is a little removed from the everyday reality of like billions of people who have access to smartphones and all kinds of opinion on all kinds of subjects online. I mean, this is the reality we live in now, and people should probably behave a little better. But the idea that you can essentially discount fan opinion, or that you should offhand, just because of some bad actors among the fan community, the professed fan community, right? We really don't know what their motives are or who they are necessarily when we're dealing with anonymous accounts and that sort of thing. It's misguided. The fact that there are some people who express themselves inappropriately in the context of criticizing an artistic work, that may be seen to just be a reflection of raw nerves, right, of passion on the part of those who are perceiving the art. So sometimes you make a provocational piece of art, it's gonna receive some intense feedback. Sometimes that is the objective. Some people in the art world would argue that is the pinnacle of art, when it evokes a strong reaction, provokes a strong response from the viewer or player or listener. So that those kinds of things are actually very germane to art appreciation as a whole. The fact that there's a commercial underpinning to all of this should just add greater incentive to treat the entire process and the process of feedback from an audience standpoint for we who choose to offer feedback with a little bit more consideration and respect than maybe has been the case up to now, or in general. I think it definitely would be worthwhile for us to be a little bit more thoughtful in our dialogue, both from the media creator standpoint and from a consumer standpoint, and from a consumer feedback standpoint. So just to finish up the article here, there is one other way to handle toxic fans on the internet. Stay off it. I'm not online, so I'm protected, says frequent Marvel star Elizabeth Olsen of WandaVision. Generally, it's a lot of positive experiences of making kids happy. I ignore the other stuff. And so Mark Malkin contributed to the story. That's a credit here. I think that's a really high note. That's a great high note to end the article on. I think it stands in very strong contrast to probably the main thrust of this article, which is essentially, in my view, it's kind of a face-saving sort of rearguard apologia for industry aloofness, industry detachment from feedback, kind of the analogy of water off a duck's back may be employed here. A lot of the feedback that fans, and this is my editorial commentary in closing, a lot of the feedback that fans have offered on a multitude of properties in recent years has been aggressively, some might characterize it as militantly, but I think that it might be a bit of a stretch, but more or less aggressively rebuffed by industry insiders, by executives, people associated with the productions, and none more so than the media, such as this author, the writer for Variety. Really none more so than the press. The press has been incredibly defensive on a lot of these topics. It has characterized feedback, sometimes scathing in nature, in almost categorically pathological terms that are adverse to considering it on its face as being worth entertaining, as being worthy of consideration. It's basically dismissive in tone, and it's basically hand-waving in character. It's essentially saying this: your perspective doesn't matter, you don't count, your opinion is bad and therefore illegitimate. In our view, that's the kind of reliable touchstones of the media response to a lot of this negative feedback, and that has, if anything, it's only incentivized and inflamed a lot of the consumer sentiment around these products. In my view, it's actually enhanced certainly the market signal for a lot of these. If that were a singular objective, it certainly has achieved that aim in many cases. But what has not been accomplished in a lot of cases is anything approaching consensus or broad scale and market reciprocated in terms of profitability. Consensus, right? There's been a noted distinct and very, very glaring difference between what audiences are asking for in some cases and what studios want. And what we find is the media kind of running interference for the studios in these cases, rather than trying to offer a voice to the fans of the artwork, to the art appreciators of this art, and to the consumer base as a whole. Typically, the media is supposed to fight for the underdog, right? That's typically some of the journalistic ethos, right? There is a phrase in that where to discomfort the comfortable, and to offer comfort or voice to those who may not be so well able to bring their concerns to the fore in public view. That's something that seems to be sorely lacking in this kind of article. This is kind of a boo, you go away sort of megaphone offered to industry, and a dismissal of the concerns of the fan community as a whole here. That's kind of what the thrust of the article is. It's, some people acted badly in relation to their response addressing a certain thing. In this case, probably movies and shows mostly, but the same thing goes for games, and especially in the Gamergate phenomenon. The media had exactly the same posture, very highly defensive, highly reactive, and highly pathologizing posture with respect to the feedback that these companies, and in some cases, artists themselves, right, but people associated with commercial enterprise, received from general audiences, sometimes very, very dedicated audiences for whatever their particular chosen artistic area was, whatever the production was. And the immunity from criticism is something that no corporate officer, especially corporate officers, but also in general rank and file members of certainly large corporations should wholesale enjoy, right? Criticism is part of, in a broader social sense, we could say, the democratic process, but it's certainly part of market democracy, right? You vote with your wallet, and you could also vote with your voice. So the idea that speaking out critically is inherently toxic, well, that's exactly what the company wants you to think. It really doesn't matter which company it is. That's kind of a corporate mantra, right? And it's a very poor one. Not all corporations conduct themselves in a way in which they would permit the mainstream media to characterize their customers that way. But entertainment is a kind of, it straddles that fine line between art and commerce, and so opinion can vary very much. Thank you for tuning in to GBAMF's inaugural video-on-demand broadcast. If you enjoyed the content presented here, please do us the favor of subscribing, liking, telling all your friends, and leaving a comment below. It's all much appreciated. GBAMFs is not just one guy talking on these subjects. I just happen to be the point man. GBAMFs is everyone who feels represented in this dialogue and wants to contribute in future broadcasts. We're seeking to build a federation, and we have an artistic appreciation society that we're in the process of building as well. So we look forward to seeing you all there. This is J-Dog, GBAMFs, signing out.